su neizvesnije od drugih. U nekima uopšte nema neizvesnosti, jer zapravo nema ni slobode izbora. Glavna pitanja sledećeg panela su kako prepoznati režim izborne autokratije i kako mu se suprotstaviti. Imamo izuzetnu čast da nam se pre panela obrati Aleksandar Čerkasov, istaknuti borac za ljudska prava iz Rusije i član Upravnog odbora Centra za odbranu ljudskih prava Memorijal, organizacije nagrađene Nobelovom nagradom za mir. Ukoliko to niste učinili, još jednom podsjećam da opremu za simultani prevod možete preuzeti na ulazu u salu. Gospodin Čerkasov će nam se obratiti na ruskom, a prevod sa ruskog je na kanalu 3. Gospodine Čerkasov, molim vas da uzmete reč.
Thank you. My English is recognized like a war crime because I go to speak Russian. This denim shirt in England is named Canadian tail coat. It's a tail coat, like for Nobel Prize. And then, спасибо большое за приглашение на этот представительный форум. Спасибо за предоставленное время. 20 минут – это много. Я постараюсь говорить медленно, так, чтобы переводчики успевали, и постараюсь сказать много. И постараюсь обойтись без банальностей. Вы знаете, что главный русский метод политической технологии, выборной технологии – это война. Что сейчас Путин трансформировал избирательную систему в России так, что, в общем, выборов у нас нет, и контроля за выборами у нас тоже нет. Вы, безусловно, знаете, что 25 лет назад Путин пришел к власти тоже с помощью войны. Никому неизвестный чиновник, имевший в августе 1999 года 2% рейтинга, с началом войны, выступая каждый раз с брутальными заявлениями, начал набирать в первые недели Второй Чеченской войны, начал набирать по 7% рейтинга каждую неделю и вскоре стал недосягаем для всех своих возможных конкурентов. Некоторые считают, что та война была специально организована, чтобы выбрали Путина, что взрывы в городах России тогда были специально организованы спецслужбами, чтобы настроить население, чтобы то выбрало Путина. Я не знаю. По-моему, это не доказано. Но вы это, безусловно, знаете. А я же буду говорить о том, о чем вы вряд ли знаете, поскольку Путин начался не в 1999 году. Те процессы, которые привели к нынешней ситуации в России, к нынешней войне в Украине, начались как минимум 6 годами раньше, в 1993 году. Первая Чеченская война, которая шла в 1994-1996 годах, вот она-то точно замышлялась и была начата как политико-технологическая операция с целью повышения рейтинга Бориса Ельцина, нашего демократического президента того времени. Дело в том, что после малой гражданской войны в России после событий октября 1993 года, после 170 убитых на улицах Москвы, сгоревшего здания парламента, обстреливаемого танками, через 2 месяца, 12 декабря 1993 года, в России прошли выборы. Точнее, прошли выборы в Верхнюю и Нижнюю палаты парламента и референдум по Конституции. Предполагалось, что население России изберет хороший парламент вместо плохого, сгоревшего в октябре. Результаты не соответствовали ожиданиям. В новом российском парламенте образца 1993 года большинство получили коммунисты и национал-патриоты, оппоненты Бориса Ельцина, а не его союзники, не его марионетки. Это был совершенно неожиданный результат, который вызвал движение в головах политических технологов того времени, которые, кажется, еще не назывались политическими технологами. И они решили, что нужно перехватить электорат коммунистов и национал-патриотов, что нужно предпринять действия, которые бы обратили симпатии российских избирателей к действующей власти. А что может быть лучше, чем война, чем возвращение в лоно империи отложившейся провинции Чечни? 12 декабря проходят эти выборы, а 16 декабря 1993 года запускается в действие план в отношении Чечни, которая к тому моменту была практически независима, план переговоров на фоне силового давления, это так называлось, который спустя год, 11 декабря 1994 года, превратился в прямую военную операцию в Чечне. Это, к сожалению, привело к последующим актам трансформации российского государства. После 1993 года, когда основным инструментом победы демократии в Москве была не воля населения, а внутренние войска, жандармерия, танки, главной опорой президента России стали силовики, как их называют в России, силовые ведомства и спецслужбы. Эти силовики, силовые ведомства, спецслужбы получили в ходе Первой Чеченской войны 1994-1996 года опыт или переняли опыт у предыдущего поколения российских военных, воевавших в Афганистане. Этот практический опыт разрушения городов и сел, пыток, внесудебных казней, этот практический опыт они потом передали следующему поколению в ходе Второй Чеченской войны. И далее, и далее. Вот эта цепь насилия, цепь практического насилия, она передавалась от одних людей в форме другим людям в форме, передавалась между ведомствами, поскольку в Чечне воевали и военные, и полиция, и другие структуры. И в итоге то, что мы сейчас наблюдаем в Украине, это прямое продолжение вот этой цепи войн, цепи преступлений, цепи безнаказанности преступлений. Менее известно, чем про войну, то, что именно после поражения на выборах в декабре 1993 года был изменен вектор пропаганды в лояльных государству средствах массовой информации. От светлого демократического будущего, которое строили Борис Николаевич Ельцин и его коллеги, этим тактическим решением телевидение, пропаганда повернулась к тому, что называлось «старые песни о главном». Образ прекрасного Советского Союза. Это было, повторю, тактическое решение. Попытка обратиться к избирателям, голоса которых были нужны на следующих президентских выборах. Но в итоге именно этот поворот, именно Первая Чеченская война, именно поворот в пропаганде подготовили Россию к 1999 году, когда Россия выбрала Путина. И вот тут я прихожу к главному. А почему, собственно, решили, что в 1993 году Россия проголосовала за коммунистов и национал-патриотов? Ну, это показали результаты выборов, которые проходили в регионах. А был ли независимый контроль на этих выборах? Независимого контроля не было. Более того, все материалы, первичные материалы, были уничтожены в течение буквально нескольких недель. Между тем, математика – это хорошая наука, статистика позволила проанализировать результаты выборов, и в изданной в 1995 году книге «Демократия, ограниченная фальсификациями» исследователи Собянин, это не мэр Москвы, это другой Собянин, Собянин и Суховольский показали, что на выборах декабря 1993 года имели место массивные фальсификации, огромный вброс голосов. Как это было возможно? Все очень просто. Я вам сказал, что это было 3 голосования. Референдум по Конституции, выборы депутатов Государственной Думы, которые не интересовали региональные власти. И на них бы не было никаких фальсификаций, если бы одновременно не проходили выборы в Верхнюю палату парламента, куда пытались избраться главы регионов. И в итоге в 59 регионах из 89 в России были избраны президенты, главы регионов и главы региональных правительств. А вот на этих выборах как раз были массированные вбросы голосов. Но ведь количество голосов общее должно быть одинаковым и на выборах в парламент, и на референдуме, и на выборах в Верхнюю палату парламента. Так что нужно докинуть вот в эти 2 корзины тоже количество голосов. И они их докинули. За кого? Главы регионов – люди простые. Не то чтобы они очень были за демократов. Как правило, это были прежние чиновники. И поэтому вбросы были за, в общем, каких-то нейтральных, но оппозиционных, за коммунистов и за либерал-демократов. Но почему это не было выявлено тогда, в 1993 году? Да потому что в регионах не было систематического наблюдения и систематического контроля на выборах. Если бы это было, то результаты тех выборов были бы, возможно, поставлены под вопрос. И, возможно, был бы поставлен под вопрос выбор, сделанный не гражданами России, а чиновниками из Кремля, из администрации президента. Выбор о повороте к традиционному электорату. И тогда, возможно, не было бы и Первой Чеченской войны, и сейчас бы я перед вами не выступал. Все могло быть иначе, если бы в России 1993 года, в декабре, было систематическое наблюдение и контроль на выборах. Это, что называется, сослагательное наклонение. Если бы. Но мне кажется, что это очень важный момент. Он не учтен современным поколением российской оппозиции. Да что говорить, собственно, в том виде, в каком я сейчас это излагаю, я это впервые так говорю. Ну, просто захотелось подготовить что-нибудь новое для вас. Но, наверное, этот наш трагический опыт, трагический не только для России, но и для Грузии, для Украины, ибо в итоге мы принесли войну в эти страны. Что наш трагический опыт, возможно, будет полезен для кого? Для кого-то. Никакой опыт не бесполезен. Вот, наверное, главное, что я хотел вам сказать, коротко. Конечно, российский опыт к этому не сводится. Я мог бы рассказать о самых свободных, в смысле контроля выборов, выборах на территории России за последние 30 лет. Это были выборы в Чечне в 1997 году. То есть такой свободы для наблюдателей не было нигде. Когда моя коллега просто отодвинула этих бородатых людей в камуфляже и с автоматами и вместо них пересчитала голоса на территориальной избирательной комиссии. Правда, там перед выборами украли брата одного из кандидатов, бывшего спикера российского парламента Руслана Хасбулатова, и Руслан Хасбулатов снял свою кандидатуру с выборов. Я мог бы вспомнить выборы, которые приводили не к стабилизации обстановки, не к переносу конфликта с улиц в стены парламента, где все вопросы решаются разговором, а наоборот, выборы спровоцировали конфликт. Но это уже другая история. Это история второго и третьего порядка. Русский опыт, если о нем вспомнить, он может быть интересен. Просто о нем никто не помнит, даже в России. Ну, может быть, несколько человек помнят. Теперь знаете и вы. Спасибо большое. Кажется, я не нарушил регламент.
Hvala, gospodine Čerkasov. Sada molim učesnice i učesnike drugog panela da zauzmu mesta na bini.
So, thank you very much. My name is Tamara Branković from CRTA, and I have a wonderful pleasure to introduce you a wonderful panel of people who are working very diligently and very passionately as practitioners, as civil society activists, as experts, but also as academics, and of course within the institutions that are supporting the democracy development in Europe, but also around the world. And basically, the panel so the topic that we're going to discuss today is how to recognize electoral authoritarianism. The panel was inspired, as colleagues said at the beginning, by this wonderful sentence of the professor Andreas Schedler, who was one of the inspirations for the event, where in democracies, parties lose elections. In authoritarian or electoral authoritarianism, opposition parties are those who lose elections. And basically, in the previous panel, we had seen how the environment right now looks like, what are the fears and the hopes for the future. And what we would like to discuss here today is actually about the mechanics and tools of how elections are not only to be considered as a tool for democratic consolidation, which is something which we all learned in schools, but also how they can be used in an opposite direction for consolidation of electoral authoritarianism, and how actually elections can be used against the democracy as such. So with me today are Zofia Banuta. She is a civil society activist and one of the co-founder of Unhack Democracy from Hungary. Welcome, Zofia.
Thank you.
Then Michael Angeloni from Protect Democracy from the United States. Masaki Higashijima, professor of political science from the University of Tokyo, right now based in Seattle. And Francesco Ronci from the Directorate of Democracy Support of the European Parliament, and also a visiting professor at the Columbia University. So where I would like to start this discussion is actually from Zofia, to talk more, or actually to bring us into Hungarian roadmap when it comes to this democracy decline we are seeing and hearing a lot about. And what I would like to ask you is actually to bring us back in time and to tell us what would you single out as a turning point for Hungarian democracy when you notice that things are starting to go bad in the wrong direction.
First of all, thank you very much for the invite. I always love to come to Belgrade. We heard about Russia just a moment ago. Hungary is not Russia yet. However, Hungary is a mafia state, and the government has been operating as a very creative criminal organization since the moment they came into power in 2010. They were propelled into power after the 2008 financial crisis with a 2/3 majority, and they wasted no time. They were fast, innovative, entrepreneurial, and creative, and they orchestrated a coup. It was a constitutional coup. They changed the constitution without any consultation and without even mentioning the word constitution during their campaign, single-handedly. They went after the electoral system. On December 23rd, 2011, just one day before the elections, they handed in the biggest reform overhaul of the electoral system, which meant we turned from a two-round system to one-round system. They introduced extreme gerrymandering, winner compensation. They gave voting rights to ethnic minorities here in Serbia, Hungarians in Serbia, Ukraine, Romania, and they basically rigged the electoral system. It's a fraudulent system. And the third pillar, I would say, is the new media law, which they orchestrated in 2010 already. And the body, the central body that oversaw the entire media landscape, from mergers and acquisitions in the media to giving out licenses, radio frequencies, and so on. So they cemented their power in this way, and again, they are a very sophisticated machinery, and they were fast, and they haven't slowed down since 2010, I would say. I can tell you when the turning point was in my life. It was in 2018 when 100,000 people marched on the streets of Budapest to demand a recount, because it was the dirtiest election since the fall of communism. And guess what happened after 100,000 people marched on the streets? Absolutely nothing. It was the dirtiest election because there was a lot of vote buying, a lot of irregularities. There were 2 Supreme Court rulings on organized frauds, busing people in from Ukraine to vote and vote buying. In addition to the extreme gerrymandering and the fraudulent system, we concluded with our investigation that they also had to use on-the-day fraud to secure the supermajority with 1 seat.
Yes.
And essentially, this was my calling.
Thank you so much for going back in time. You know, it's difficult actually to talk about all these things. We will get back to Masaki in this conversation about when strategies change and when tactics and for which purposes leaders are choosing one strategy or the other. But I would like first to go to Michael and basically looking into this Hungarian roadmap. Your organization, Protect Democracy in the US, you deal with the elections, but you also have a wonderful project on authoritarian playbook. And the first sentence of the authoritarian playbook is, authoritarian takeovers rarely happen overnight. So could you elaborate for this audience here a little bit more on that, like how it actually happens, and how do you see this roadmap of, you know, like what is the first victim, what the second, what the third, and so on of the authoritarian takeover, please?
Yes, well, thank you for the question, and thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be on the panel here today, speaking with all of you. Just to give a brief overview of my organization, Protect Democracy, we are a nonpartisan, cross-ideological nonprofit with the explicit goal of preventing further democratic decline and authoritarianism in the United States. Just to give a brief background, our 2 founders, who previously served in the White House Counsel Office, were both a bit alarmed at the end of 2016 and early 2017, and were thinking to themselves, why is no one ringing any alarm bells about what we're hearing and seeing in the US? With that question in mind, they turned to experts, scholars, lawyers, who all pretty much replied in unison, thank goodness that you're asking that question now. And together they formed the basis of what is now Protect Democracy. And our work is informed a lot about what we've seen overseas and internationally throughout the entire global democratic recession. To go back to your first question that you posed, one of the products that we've released recently is called the Authoritarian Playbook. And part of the impetus for that research was the idea, which I think is the goal of this conference and this panel in particular, which is that today's autocrats do not typically assume power through military coup or brute force. It's through legalistic means. And what we determined was that most autocrats contemporarily, that is, establish and entrench themselves through legal procedures, including elections. And through the use of these different salami tactics, so-called, to slice away at democracy, sliver by sliver, until they are fully entrenched. And so we've laid out 7 key tactics that are common across contemporary authoritarian regimes. Those include the politicization of independent institutions, the aggrandizement of executive power, the spread of disinformation, the quash of any type of dissent, the targeting of vulnerable or marginalized communities. And then the final 2 steps that are common across all authoritarian regimes are the corruption of elections and the stoking of violence. And those 2 final pieces are what we've seen in the United States following the 2020 presidential election, where we had local, state, and members of the executive branch working in coordination to spread disinformation and corrupt the electoral process. Luckily, their goals did not play out in 2020, but that has been what we've been working toward ever since. And so that's the impetus of the project. And as we saw in 2020, the corruption of the elections by these figures led to violence on January 6th. So all of these pieces are intertwined and create the authoritarian playbook that we see today.
Thank you so much. And could you just maybe tell me if any of those dimensions has bigger weight compared to the others? So is there some specific order how, like authoritarian sect and, like, is there something that they would pick first, or it's not, it doesn't matter?
I mean, they all work together in tandem, and it's almost like a snowball effect. So one happens, and then the rest occur and get bigger and bigger and more dangerous. Yes. But if I had to say, I would say that the politicization of independent institutions is typically an early step that we see, and one of the most lethal for democracy.
Thank you so much. Now I would like to move the discussion to Masaki. In your book, The Dictator's Dilemma at the Ballot Box, Electoral Manipulation, Economic Maneuvering, and Political Order in Autocracies, you talk about 9 out of 10 autocracies nowadays, so in contemporary times, are having elections. And that autocracies or regimes with authoritarian tendencies increasingly tend to hold the elections with bigger participation of the opposition than that would be the case in history. So could you elaborate more on that, and why is this so? Why elections are now used as a tool?
Thanks for the question and for the kind invitation. So the underlying factor is a big change in the international system, so the end of the Cold War. So electoral autocracies rapidly increased soon after the demise of the Soviet Union. And so those new types of autocrats sought foreign aid and other forms of international assistance, primarily from Western countries. And the new international system incentivized them to hold multi-party elections to behave themselves like democrats. But in this sense, they seek to international legitimacy by holding multi-party elections. But however, more importantly, while holding elections, electoral autocrats began to learn that they can reap some benefits by holding multi-party elections. So in autocratic regimes, rulers always suffer the lack of information about what citizens think about rulers and how strong dictators are. So in order to gather such information, the research shows that the dictators try to use those elections. And the elections have broadly 3 roles according to some the established research. So the first, by winning elections overwhelmingly, with high scores like 80%, 90% of vote shares, dictators can demonstrate that they are very strong and powerful enough to gather public support from citizens. And this prevents potential opponents from rebelling up against the dictator. And the second the function is that information gathering function. So by holding elections, dictators can gather some information from the election results about the distribution of support for ruling elites and also opposition parties. So in dictatorships, media and other information channels are really not well developed. So the dictators try to complement those information channels with elections. And the third function is divide and conquer function. So by holding elections, opposition parties need to think about whether they should participate in elections, or after election results come about, they have to decide whether to protest against the government. And at each phase of decisions, opposition parties have some opportunity to be divided by the government. So those 3. So I would say that there are 3 those benefits for autocrats to hold multi-party elections. So there is a domestic benefits as well as international benefits for autocrats.
Thank you so much. We will actually go back to the strategies which authoritarians apply, and I would like just to quickly go to Francesco. And I mean, you work with democracy support programs. And speaking of all these things, the question is how busy you are these days, and to what extent authoritarian tendencies maybe, I don't know, make your life harder, or maybe, you know, like make your efforts less visible. So, you know, like, what do you do?
So thank you very much. So my life is very hard, but I'm very happy to be here with you. So you are softening my life, and my presence here wants to be a testament to the great job done by CERTA to support democracy in Serbia and in Europe, because there are theoretical discussions and then there is the practice. And you are the people, you are the one who are really embodying democracy support in Europe. Let me start with the clarification. I heard in the previous panels some references to hybrid regimes. And I know that in the case of Hungary, for example, it's quite popular to label that country as an illiberal democracy. And we also hear in the academic discussions a lot of references to competitive authoritarianism and other ideas of hybrid regimes. Make no mistake, there is no hybrid regime. There is either democracy or authoritarianism. Because these two political regimes, they stem from two principles that are incompatible: freedom and oppression. And there can't be any compromise between freedom and oppression. And when people use these terms, this idea of hybrid regimes, basically the goal is to soften an authoritarian regime. And And how do we recognize what is the difference between an autocratic and a democratic regime? Well, it's the protection of basic civil and political rights. The rights that enable citizens' participation in the civil and political life. Rights of participating in free and fair elections, for example. Rights to have free and independent media. So this is the litmus test to understand what a democratic or an authoritarian regime is. And then I think it's also important, and I like very much what the previous speakers have said. I think it's important to understand that the technique have changed. And one very important technique to establish authoritarianism today is executive aggrandizement. The idea that through presidentialization of power, through concentration of power in the hands of the executive, you can break checks and balances in the political system. And the targets of this executive aggrandizement are always the same: the judiciary, media, and last but not least, parliaments. You can, wherever you are in the world, you can see that the first target when they try to establish an authoritarian regime is parliament. In Myanmar, they shut down parliament when they made the coup. In other countries, there is a process of marginalization of parliaments. But the objective, the target is always the same: parliament. Parliament as a symbol, as a forum of pluralism and diversity.
Thank you so much. And definitely, I mean, we understand what you're saying, we are seeing what you're saying, and from many assessments, including, I mean, now talking about Serbia, that actually things have started to go bad for democracy in the time when power started to centralize in the hands of the executive, and then centralized even further. But on the other hand, you know, like what Michael also mentioned, this politicization of institutions can be, you know, like singled out as as this ground zero, let's put it like that. And we will go back to the roles of the parliament and what can we do. So thank you very much for bringing that into today's discussion and the discussion we will have over the next 3 days. But I would like to introduce you to something which Sophia told me when we were getting ready for the panel. And then you have this wonderful and very interesting idea of psychological effects of electoral authoritarianism or authoritarian leaders. And you also spoke about, on the other hand, the crisis of imagination. So maybe it would be good to share the discussion with the audience.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, they stole our countries, or in case they stole my country, Hungary, but they shouldn't, and they cannot steal our imagination. The fact is that I think in Hungary, after the 2022 elections, the fourth consecutive supermajority, a new era began, and that's an era of depression, which obviously started a little bit before, but there is this helplessness, hopelessness, and the media brainwashing and fear-mongering has done a really effective job, unfortunately. And the media is being used as a weapon to discredit, to make you fearful, to wage smear campaigns against journalists, civil society leaders, and opposition leaders. So it's a well-oiled machine. I mean, imagine 80% of the media is controlled by them. However, which is why we started at Unhack Democracy with hope-based communications, our new initiative called Rewire Your Mind, Rewire Your Country. It's a hope-based mindset shift incubator for civil society leaders from Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, and Ukraine to create a new vision and exercise our hope muscle so we can be more creative and more risk-takers to create a new vision from the ground up.
Yes, so basically the intention of the leaders who reach towards authoritarian mechanisms is actually to deny access to any kind of hope and mobilization, basically, where on the other hand, we would definitely need to talk about, like how civil society organizes, how we, and when actually we all together start working for the next sustainable change that should happen in elections. Michael, we heard the previous panel, a lot of talks about the US and elections in the US. And we listened about the dangers when incumbent president claims or actually denies the results as it happened in the US. But the fact is, when we spoke, you said election fraud is considered officially rare in the US. But we also saw that when it happens, institutions are there to respond. So maybe it is isolated, but then institutions respond. And I would just like to remind or to tell the audience that an election clerk in the US was sentenced to 9 years in prison over voter interference. That happened a month ago or something like that when this news broke. However, what I would like to talk to you is what is the extent to which those who cry election fraud, to what extent these groups that are getting increasingly vocal in the US are actually making the damage to impartial, independent election observation and to the findings and evidence which election observers, based on like international and scientific methodologies, basically discover. Can that manipulate also those findings?
Yeah. So I'll just start off by saying what you mentioned in the premise of your question, which is that recent history shows us that US elections are very secure. And to your point about the case of the clerk who was recently convicted, she was convicted for allowing an unauthorized individual into a voting machine area following the 2020 election because she was one of the officials who was following the claims of voter fraud that were in itself disinformation and fraudulent. And so I think that with that in mind, that voter fraud in the US is exceedingly rare, the issue then becomes, like you said, who are those that manipulate fears of fraud for their own benefit? So to answer those questions, we've established a framework to identify these election subversion tactics which have taken hold in the US. In the US, those who seek to manipulate our elections, they deceive the public with these narratives of fraud that they then use to disrupt our election administration process, and those two snowball into an effect that then creates an opportunity for them to deny the election certification process. So those three steps, deceive, disrupt, and deny, are at the heart of the election subversion issue in the US. And it is like an issue of the boy who cries wolf, because the false narratives will inherently create fear and then also mitigate any potential real instances of fraud or foreign interference in our elections. But those three areas are the key to subversion in the US context.
Thank you. We will come back in the end, actually, to talk about what should be done. But I have an urge, actually, to ask you, in your opinion, from your work, your experience as Protect Democracy, what you're doing actually and if you're doing anything in combating that kind of manipulation.
Well, right now we've released this framework, and the goal is to inform journalists and the press of how to cover these tactics, because we see it every day, every hour, there's someone claiming that the election is going to be rigged or there's going to be fraud, and these are false, debunked claims. So our first goal is to provide journalists with the tools they need to address these claims head on, and to provide a framework that allows them to do so. That's the first step that we're taking right now as we gear up in 2 weeks for the big day.
Yes, and thank you so much for your time to be here with us ahead of this busy time. So Masaki, the question which actually was posed at the very beginning, but let's talk about it now. Basically, the question is, when do leaders decide to change tactics and maybe to go through, from using one manipulative techniques, such as you were mentioning economic policies that are used, and we will talk about that at this conference about the clientelism and similar methods used to control the voters. But when this switch happens from reaching towards this manipulation, power centralization, media power and capture, to actual mechanisms of election fraud, when you actually steal the elections. So when the change of technique happens.
So what methods autocrats are more likely to use over others maybe could be explained by many factors. But based upon my field research in Central Asia and also cross-national analysis of the data on autocratic elections, I suggest that it's very important to start from a dilemma that dictators face when designing elections. So as I said earlier, dictators face an information shortage problem, and the elections mitigate such problem. But if dictators, blatantly manipulate elections, then the, information benefits that they can receive maybe, disappear. So it means that dictators need to take balance between credibility of election results and certainty of winning big. So if they hold relatively, less free and fair elections, relatively free and fair elections, then they can reap the benefit of information. Like they can, credibly demonstrate their power, and also they can gather information from below. So dictators face dilemma, and I think there are three methods dictators can mitigate this problem. So the first method is gearing toward economic distribution strategy. So particularly if they have rich financial resources and strong party organizations which enable them to streamline such economic distribution, then they can distribute goodies to citizens to boost public support. So they do not need to manipulate elections through blatant electoral fraud, like ballot stuffing or election violence or other blatant ways of electoral manipulation. So this means that to what extent power resources dictators have would be very important to predict what kind of methods they use. And second point is that if they have sophisticated methods of disinformation and propaganda to directly affect popular preferences on voting, then they may not need to use blatant forms of electoral manipulation. So as Michael said, the many different kinds of autocrats use disinformation and propaganda, but to what extent they can deploy such strategies in sophisticated ways, it may affect to what extent they have to rely on blatant electoral fraud. And the third toolkit that dictators can use is the manipulation of electoral systems, as Sophia said, so like gerrymandering and so on. So in electoral autocracies where the ruling party is only big party, so single-member district system is an electoral system where only ruling party can gain seat bias, which is different from democratic countries where if you have two big parties, then the SMD systems provide big seat premium to big parties, regardless of ruling parties or opposition parties. But in electoral authoritarian regimes, ruling parties are only big parties. So SMD systems, significantly bias in favor of ruling parties. So if they do not have, strong financial resources or party organizations, then they tend to stick to SMD systems. But if they have rich financial resources to distribute, then they do not need to use seat premium from SMD systems. So my research found that they tend to shift their electoral systems from SMD to PR. So this is the third strategy, the manipulation of electoral systems. So I think dictators try to take balance between those totally different electoral manipulation techniques to stay in power.
Yeah, as long as they are the biggest or the most, they have the most prospects to stay in power, unless there is a challenger on the other side. Yeah, okay, thank you so much. Francesco, let's talk about parliaments once again. And basically, can you maybe delve into more details on how the democracy support program of the European Parliament is addressing the issues that we are talking right now? And of course, if you can tell which countries are right now getting the most attention, or every country is close to your heart.
So, the European Parliament has put in place several tools to support democracy. Electoral observation, and I think it's also thanks to these efforts, the efforts of institutions like the European Parliament, but also civil society organizations such as CERTA, if forms of blatant violations, of blatant manipulation of elections cannot take place any longer, and that's what you were referring to. We also put in place some programs to cope with toxic polarization in the political systems, dialogue and mediation. We work with civil rights, with the human rights activists, and we try to support them directly. And we also help parliaments to develop capacities, because, as I said, functioning parliaments are really the best indicator to understand the state of democracy. And we do that, of course, we have a global ambition, but we do that in particular in pre-accession countries, in countries that would like to join the European Union. But let me answer a question, not just about the how and where we do that, but also why.
Yes.
Because no one has asked the European Parliament, has forced to oblige the European Parliament to do democracy support. And the European Parliament is the only parliamentary institution in the world to do democracy support with such an extent. Well, I think that the European Union is a different political animal compared to nation states. Nation states, like Serbia, I'm Italian, like Italy, they have their legitimation from the fact that they have a nation. There is a nation the Italian nation that has been established historically, and then the state, and the state then developed, morphed into a democracy. The European Union was born not as a nation, but as a community of law, as a community based on three principles: democracy, the rule of law, and human rights protection. So supporting democracy for the European Union, and supporting democracy within the European Union, but also in the country that would like to join the European Union, is really an existential task for our organization. If there is no democracy, if there is no rule of law, there is no European Union. And that's why it's so important for the European institutions and for the European Parliament in particular to be active and assertive on these issues.
And thank you very much. I mean, the mission that you have and delegations which you take, I mean, here talking from Serbian experience, were extremely, extremely important for us domestic actors. I mean, together with ODIHR, OSCE, Parliamentary Assembly, and all the others, we see European Parliament's role as crucial. We have 15 minutes left, but I think it's maybe the time to ask the audience if there are some questions for our panelists. This is the Q&A time. So please. No questions? Okay, I have some spare, I mean, actually not spare, but something that I actually wanted to talk and maybe to conclude the panel while you think about your questions. So I would like each of you to 2 to 3 minutes basically reflect, especially Zofia, but also Michael, Masaki, and Francesco, on what should be done by whom and when, something which Francesco actually gave a little bit in his address. I mean, the thing for us is if we should focus on electoral conduct, which, you know, like in all of these countries, with all of these features of democracies or authoritarianism, ODIHR is assessing as well-administered elections. So we have ODIHR colleagues in the audience. I mean, happy to talk about it. But, you know, like well-administration of elections, we see is not enough. But it's not even a half of enough. How do we tackle basically this broader range of institutional, legislative, and information manipulation? And how do we make the change that how do we fix the elections so they bring change again, and how that change can be sustainable in a sense, you know, like not to go back where we were in the past. So whoever would like to start, I don't know, Zofia, maybe you, we also talk about this, you know, like the day after those perfect elections.
The day after? Well, you know, don't expect a liberal democracy the day after. This is a very difficult question, Tamara. Thank you for passing it on to me. I always believe that the answer is grassroots, and we need to enable civil society to do what it does best, to talk to people, to reach people on the ground, to involve people, to educate people, because only lasting change can only come from the bottom up. Unfortunately, when you're in the EU, I don't know what happens when you're outside the EU, but when you are inside the EU, the funding model is completely broken to enable these kind of initiatives. I've heard about venture philanthropy in the United States, which I would love to bring over to Europe, because we need to instill this startup mentality, long-term investment instead of project horizon, and instill trust in people who are leaders on the ground who will make things happen.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Michael?
Yeah, a bit of a difficult question, but I'll answer by just going through a brief overview of some of the steps that we've taken as an organization. So, as I mentioned at the start, our organization is focused on protecting elections, but also reestablishing the rule of law, countering disinformation, and improving our democracy for the long term. So in the short and medium term, we've taken steps legislatively to improve some vulnerabilities that existed following the 2020 election. We had an archaic law called the Electoral Count Act that was very vague in how our electors were selected and how they were certified, and the role of the vice president in certifying the election, which became an issue on January 6th. And so our team worked with partners to create the Electoral Count Reform Act, which was passed in 2022, which clarifies some of those challenges and issues and will hopefully allow for a smoother transition following this upcoming election. On the countering disinformation front, we've partnered with law firms and represented those who have been defamed as a result of disinformation. So for instance, we represented 2 Georgia poll workers who faced threats and defamation from election deniers following the 2020 election, and they were able to receive a settlement from those who were defaming them. So our intent is for such cases to prevent that type of behavior going forward, as sort of a deterrent to that kind of behavior. And then long term, we're always researching and thinking of ways to enhance US democracy for the future, whether that's instilling a new electoral system or different type of measures that can restore some trust and faith in our democracy. That's also an area that we're looking at on the horizon.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, looking forward.
Yeah. Yes.
Masaki, I mean, you have an experience also from a lot of experience from Central Asia, where your book actually you got inspiration and research data for your book. So like how can you comment from that? From the position of like Central Asia, now being here in the Balkans, seeing what's happening around the world, so many similarities, so many different narratives about these different countries. But yeah, I mean, how do you look ahead?
Yeah, so it's of course a complex question, but I would say that it may be important to extend international assistance beyond non-electoral periods, as well as electoral periods, to further advance democratization. It's quite very difficult in this era of democratic backsliding. But now dictators know that their elections are closely monitored during electoral periods. So their election manipulation techniques are getting more sophisticated. Not only using blatant electoral fraud, they can have a wide variety of electoral manipulation repertories, like changing electoral system change, electoral system reform, disinformation and propaganda, and also other electoral law regulation to produce electoral results in favor of them. And those subtle electoral manipulation techniques are almost all produced in non-electoral periods. So yeah. They try to manipulate electoral law in non-electoral periods, and also they can produce some advanced techniques of disinformation and propaganda, mostly in non-electoral periods to prepare for elections. So they invest a lot in non-electoral periods, but international assistance has been focusing more on electoral periods to make elections free and fair. So it's quite difficult, because we have very, severe budget constraints. But it may make sense to just go beyond the electoral periods, so that you can we may be able to advance democratization further.
Yes, and I mean, thank you so much for the remarks, because when we assess these flaws in democracy, we call them flaws in democracy, but maybe we should actually start thinking more and more about changing the narrative, and it's actually about it's not only a flaw in democracy, it's actually moving to the other pole, like to the other side, where like you have full dictatorship with, full repression of human rights, and so on and so forth. So definitely, maybe this can actually be used as a sort of a roadmap to start talking more openly about, what's actually happening, and not putting into those nice forms and nice words. Francesco?
Yes, I agree. Three things. I agree with you, with what you were saying. First is clarity.
Yes.
If there's an authoritarian regime, you need to call it authoritarian. If there is corruption, you need to call it corruption. If there is media manipulation, you need to call it media manipulation. This is the starting point. It's a form of intellectual honesty, and I think that's where we have to start from. Second, I think we need to be bolder. We need to be bolder on that. And we don't have to be on the defensive. It's time of change. And I don't believe in relativism. I don't believe in the idea that there are some political regimes that are prone to democracy and other societies that are not. No one should go back to Yalta, where there were some parts of Europe or some parts of the world that were considered as autocratic by definition or under the influence of a power, and we shouldn't care. You can call it democracy, you can give it another name, but I believe that the principle of individual dignity, of individual autonomy and agency is universal. And you see it in Iran, you see it in Afghanistan. Third point, and this is something about us, about the European Union, we need to do our homework. In the sense that democracies have a competitive advantage with authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is rigid, and that's why they collapse, basically, in one day. Yeah. Democracies are flexible. But in order to be flexible, we need to be creative. And it's clear that there are many things that are not working well in democratic regimes. In particular, many people, they feel that they're not heard, that they're not listened to from their institutions. And so we need to innovate. We need to experiment new ways of participating. As European Parliament, for example, we have been the first institution to try to experiment new forms of deliberative and participatory democracy in the Balkans, for example. We did a Citizens' Assembly against corruption in Montenegro, bringing together citizens randomly selected and opening the doors of the parliament of that country to this form of mobilization. Yes. So clarity, assertiveness, and creativity.
Perfect. Thank you so much. This is a perfect conclusion. And I would go back once again to the public to ask if there are any questions for the panel. As we are reaching, or the time is about to expire, we are very timely. I would like to ask participants, or actually to inform you that the lunch is going to be served in 3 minutes. The room is just next door, so you just exit this one and enter the one which is next door. So the lunch is going to be served there. There's going to be plenty of time for lunch, so until 3 p.m. 3 p.m. we meet here, and we have 2 more panels by the end of this working day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, the panel.